All right. So what's the topic today?
The topic today is, well, how do we get around to today's topic? I think it'd be great to sort of like go through the conversation we had earlier when it came to the flow of basically discussing the flow of assets that we had, and suddenly realizing that some of the decisions we made are great, but if we
I
had to,
said hello Roderick, and hello Stan, and hello Roderick, and hello Louis, or Louis, and hello Mikey, and hello Cat. Yes. So if we want to get there, I should ask people the question I asked you, which triggered all of this.
which is
Is a hot dog a sandwich? So take
it's
a
a very
moment,
good question.
ponder,
Yep,
and you can write your answers in the comments, or if you're watching this later in the doobly doo. Um,
comments. Yep.
Michael, would you say a hot dog is a sandwich?
On a and my answer earlier was if you zoom out and just look at it holistically, yes, it's something in between bread.
Now, what interests me about this question is not the question itself, because my answer is if you like.
It doesn't
What
really
interests
matter.
me is how passionate I've seen people get about this on social media. Like they will actually argue about if a hot dog is a sandwich. Because, well, my because for this, my thinking for this is humans love categories, right? We like our brains work through pattern recognition. Putting
Yeah.
things in categories makes things easier, and categories make things really easy up to a point.
Yes. In fact, the thing that actually sparked the conversation is I've been moving a lot of my data around recently, and I ended up with the best part of 10 terabytes worth of data over the last 20 plus years. I've managed to sort of start organizing it about, and now I've actually organized it and deduplicated a lot of the data. I suddenly realized that I'm going to have a bit of a categorization because over those 20 years, I've had different standards and different ways of categorizing my work. And you don't want to end up with a system that has a hierarchy so big you can't find anything except by searching. So you only really want to go a couple of layers deep whenever you do that. But then you end up with replacing that depth of search with breadth of search if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very different, and that very quickly came on to discussing how an asset pipeline would work when it comes to naming conventions. Where do you put your textures? Where do you put your models? Where do you put this? Where do you put that? Because I've certainly had in the past a an issue when it comes to the way that an artist would want to have assets stored and their textures stored is different to how the game developers going to want their hierarchy.
Right.
And that you have to work to one or the other standards, or you have to have like a hard break where the game developer never gets your hierarchy. They get like a baked version that comes out in their new hierarchy. But then
And it
you
was
end
one
up
of
with
those.
two bits of data
Yeah.
that are no longer synchronized. So if you update a texture and don't push it, the other team don't get it, which is bad.
And that brought us on to trying to figure out workflow when you're first starting a game, right? Especially if it's not just you, if it's multiple people working on it, where you really need to understand how the assets are going to be created and what they need to do and how they're going to be used. Like you need to understand how you're going to read the stuff and all the rest of it. And if I can share my screen real quick, I can show the example we were talking about.
Yep. There we go.
Well, I can explain it while you're doing it.
Okay.
We looked at our first pass of procedural weapon generation, and one of the things I did when I was making this sword maker scene was I created a system for materials. So, if we um, if we load up the hilt of the blade of a sword, right?
Yep.
We'll say set the surface by the material, etc., etc. So we have a bunch of materials for our weapons. So let me find our materials. Here's our weapon materials. Mikey's camera is just broken.
Oops.
So
Yep.
let's look at copper. And if I look at copper, I've got the actual material it's using, like the actual well, it's not a texture, but the spatial material it's using. How much damage is added by this material, and how much value. And then I had this great idea. Let's make it feel a bit more organic while still making it an algorithm. So when we're generating this, the edge of the blade counts more towards damage than the center of the blade, but the center of the blade counts more towards the value, like how much you can buy it for, the material cost.
Yeah.
which is great, except that was never part of the original design. And I saw no reason to share that with Michael. And some of the swords, when you look at the actual mesh, surface 1 is the edge, and on some of them, surface 1 is the center, which starts having gameplay impacts. Because now, what you think is a, gold and steel sword is now a steel and gold sword, which suddenly starts becoming important because it'll do less damage than you're expecting or be worth less money than you're expecting. And that's interesting because that was just a little failure in communication. And it's at this stage a really easy fix. But because of the way we've categorized our workflow, I never communicated how I was going to use these meshes. I just said, give me some meshes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, Michael.
Okay. I will. There you go, full screen. Right. Let's move you back over here. So yeah, and one of the things that very, very quickly we came across was going back and trying to sort those out could be a lot of work, because potentially hundreds of weapons. In this case, it's only 5 blades, 5 hilts, 5 pummels, or something along those lines. So it wouldn't be too arduous to go back and put material slot 1 has this, material slot 2 has that. But what happens when both it's a steel and steel sword? I'm likely to only put the one material on the whole model. So suddenly you get a blade that's only got one material.
What if the weapon has more than 2 channels, but you decide that this particular model looks better with only 2, or just with only 1? Well, suddenly the whole way we're generating weapons doesn't make sense. Or do you have to put all those materials in for every model, even if you don't use them? At which point, what's the impact on draw calls?
Yes, because you could have a load of unused material slots essentially, but they're on the object, and I'm guessing it's engine dependent, because you may find that one engine, Unreal, might be clever and go, oh, well, they're not being used, I'll cull them. Another engine might go, well, they're on there, so I'm going to use them. So you end up with these draw calls on models that it doesn't need.
Potentially. I actually don't know if Godot will do the draw call if it's not used. I haven't experimented with this.
No.
So yeah, we wanted to talk about different ways you can organize your workflow, the kinds of conversations you want to be having, even if you're just working by yourself. Because it's one of those things where redesigning a system from the ground up is much more difficult than designing it from the ground up. Especially if you're doing something critical like, hey, let's add in multiplayer. Right? That is not a conversation you want to have halfway through the development of a game. Or even there are some games on Steam that add multiplayer after they've been out for a year, and I'm like, that must have been an insane amount of work. Like, I don't even understand how you okayed that. Like, more power to you, but no.
Unless it was designed with multiplayer in the first place, it just wasn't ready at the launch, so they promised it later on. Yeah, that's always a possibility. Yeah, and a lot of the stuff that we end up going through is great because we've got hindsight and we've got the capacity to go backwards and forwards and work out a journey from there.
Well, we've also got a thing where we're creating everything at least twice, once for our prototype and once for the course. So the mistakes we make in the beginning are actually really valuable for us because we can, avoid them and use them as teaching moments.
Yeah, definitely. I've just done a quick bit of research, by the way. It appears certainly of the last version of Unreal, they do count for draw calls. I don't know about Godot, but it's probably quite standard that the material, if it's in the slot, then it's a loaded material and therefore it's a draw call. So watch out.
You better watch out. You better watch.
No.
Yeah, Roderick says it's just adding another player, right? Yeah, no, I'm sure. Ow, that hurts. So, if we use this procedural weapon design that we've been talking about and playing with as a starting point, right? Because when it first started, one of the questions Michael asked was, do you want me to just generate a bunch of weapons and hand them to you, like remade?
Yeah.
And my answer was no, I want you to give me the pieces because it's going to be easier and smaller to generate them in Godot than it is to handle a much larger file size and then pick the one we want out of that list.
Yeah, definitely. You're dealing with the difference of, let's say, each part of a 3-part weapon, there's 5 individual parts, then you've got 15 parts. So that's a lot less memory intensive. And then you assemble them in Godot and done. If you've got that and all their permutations, and I give you all of those, you've got actually more things to go through, more materials to check, more assets to put together, which is something that we want to optimize as much as possible.
Now, this does have some side effects. One of them is, if we'd gone with the original suggestion, Mikey could have curated them. This sword looks too much like that one. This one is boring. That's ugly. This is really cool. Let's do a couple more like that.
Yeah.
Right? We can't do that. So we now have to handle that at the modular stage and at the algorithm stage rather than just having swords that look cool.
The great thing, though, with